let's get into this. Look, there's a bunch of stuff there as to why we believe we're in the right place to be helping organisations. But let's get into the fun of it. So the agenda for today is it's quite simple. We'll talk about the current landscape on data and privacy and why data discovery is important. Then we'll jump into some live stories and some live information, and I think you'll find that particularly interesting. So I'm gonna flick past to you, Carl, and you've got the mic.
Easy, not a problem. So yeah, as Errol said, really, I suppose some of the unstructured data problems that we see and we often sort of talk about. So summed up in a couple of these, they aren't all of them, but they're definitely some. Obviously, again, data growth is out of control. Unstructured data continues to make up 80-90%, depending on which statistic you look at. Interestingly enough, 80% of documents never get used again, and 70% of documents get recreated. So as Errol said before, our content management, information management hat, but also our data governance hat, these are some interesting stats that sort of go through it. We've also got those examples around backup. So again, if from an IT perspective, the more data we keep getting, the longer the backup is, the longer the RTOs or RPOs, so recovery point objectives or time objectives. And again, that sort of big scenario of just we've got too much, what do we do with it? We've also had some clients recently on the next point around migrating to Microsoft 365. So there's as an approach to sort of quote, lift and shift, and just take everything from, a network drive or wherever into SharePoint, OneDrive or Teams. It's the Teams pandemic, we've called it recently. So obviously those types of things, storage is cheap, cloud is easy, quote. It's been quite interesting to see that in recent times, we've actually had some CTOs and CIOs come to us and say, I've actually run out of storage. So from a Microsoft perspective, they're now saying it's full, what do I do? For, rewind 10 years, it was just throw it there, it doesn't matter. And some examples we'll talk about in a little bit more detail about what we've found when you do a lift and shift as well. We've got that example of finding sensitive information. Again, we'll talk a little bit, I suppose, more about obviously the current political climate around cybersecurity, any sort of breaches that have happened, and we'll talk through that. Also that ability to, I suppose, e-discover or information searches. So, every state does them differently. They're an RTI, they're an FOI, they're literally a Hail Mary search from an IT perspective. It's anything around that approach. And also data breaches, which again, that sensitive info and data breaches is kind of hand in hand a bit where, and this is a question we've been asking clients for, I think about 6 years now, Sarah, where we say, if your network drive got breached today, what would you actually lose? So, and a lot of organizations, including the C-suite, so CTOs, DOs, and IOs, have really just gone, we've lost 500 gig of data, but they can't tell us what we have lost. And obviously that's been pretty relevant in recent times. Again, Optus, there's been thousands of them. These been happening for a while. It's quite interesting that of recent times, everyone's a lot more aware. And I've got a favorite saying that I'll talk to in a second around that. But in relation to Optus, I think the big thing was there was that contradiction of I should keep it, I should remove it. So two different policies saying two different things. If I wear my information management hat, which a few of us in the room have, versus I suppose the scenario of just, we should get rid of it or we just have because we have it. Again, it's sort of that sort of stalemate that made it a bit of a challenge. I thought it was also interesting around it's sort of impossible to manually manage that type of scale of information. And even in smaller clients we deal with of 10 terabytes all the way through to petabytes, it's the same example. And I think interesting in Australia, and this last 2 points are, we've been saying this for a while now, but we're pretty lax when it comes to privacy. We're very lax around respect for people's information. You'll hear about a use case of one that's close to home from me about how my information got breached. That's why I'm a little bit more invested, as is probably thousands of other people since then. Obviously, Medibank, and again, this is that interesting point I mentioned before, like when there's actually a breach, what have you physically lost? And if you've been a Medibank customer or an Optus customer, again, I've been playing IT support for both mum and dad who are Medibank customers. And it's interesting around that the key word here is they do not believe that access has been found for these things. So they actually don't know until something is leaked on, a dark web or in a space. And again, it's quite interesting around them not actually being really 100% sure what's actually been, I suppose, compromised or lost for that citizen. Late last year, I was actually attended a cybersecurity conference, and Andy, yourself was there, so I got to meet yourself. But one of the key interesting things, so this was one of the biggest key takeaways or key takeaways I had from the conference. So it's one of the biggest conferences for cybersecurity in Australia. There was people from information management, records management, cybersecurity, data, all those things. We're all in the same boat. But what I thought was quite interesting was all the cyber teams were very nervous post-Optus. Makes sense, right? They didn't want to be the next headline. But I actually, when I went round and spoke to delegates and spoke to vendors and literally it was a 3-day conference, it was quite interesting that everyone was looking at protecting the information, or as in like an endpoint protection, multi-factor authentication, the threat detection, Essential 8, perimeter firewalls. So all the outer and or internal type stuff, but no one was actually looking at what type of information they had. So every time I asked that question of a delegate, or every time I asked that question of a vendor, how do you actually manage what you have and how do you know what you have? There was a lot of sort of blank looks and I suppose, oh, that's a good point, comments. So interesting sort of takeaway for the IM people of the room. It's our bread and butter. But again, it was interesting from everyone else. That was all about stopping someone coming in, stopping someone going out, but not what you've actually got within your holding, so to speak. Cybersecurity, this is an interesting one. So we actually have cybersecurity insurance. We needed to get it for a contract that we had a couple of years back now. But interestingly enough, last year it went up 500%. So for a small business, $15,000 a year on cybersecurity insurance is pretty high. I still remember the days, that was probably about 4 or 5 years ago, where it was this new thing. People had to have it. Quote, and people didn't really know what it was. It was quite hard to insure. It was quite hard for people to understand what they needed to manage as part of that. And then I suppose now imagine the cost for if you're a large organisation. So I know in Queensland, as an example, Queensland government doesn't actually have cyber insurance. Their mandate is we don't pay, which is an interesting sort of approach. It might be different in other states or territories. But when you think about the information that everyone hold, whether you're Department of Health, whether you're the Crime Corruption Commission, Premier and Cabinet, all those things, wherever you may be from, there's a fair bit of actual information and value for that information that you actually hold. One of the examples which Errol and I actually presented to the big 3 out of the 4 big banks and a number of, say, top 10 banks late last year. And it was quite interesting because I went through this presentation or an abridged version of it and made a comment around, it's kind of like insurance for your home. And I'm looking outside because I've got a window right here. But, when you go do your home insurance policy, you've got to say, well, I've got locks and I've got Crim Safe and I've got security cameras, and it lowers your premium. And I made the, I suppose, scenario of saying maybe this is where we'll go for cyber insurance at a point in time, that organizations will need to prove their level of compliance or what they're actively doing. And I say the word actively in that statement, versus just saying, oh, I've got it, tick a box and move on. And it was actually interesting. 2 of the banks said we actually have purchased cybersecurity companies to actually upskill our, I suppose, people who are having insurance policies to lower the risk that they have to pay out on a premium, which again was quite an interesting sort of scenario where we were thinking this is going to be where it's at, and they're going, we're buying little companies, sending them in to help, organizations, whether you're a mum and dad shop or a multinational, just to continue to lower and I suppose increase that cybersecurity awareness and I suppose policy within it. So a little bit about the unstructured data from the trenches. So this is some of our stories. I talked about my favorite quotes. I've got 3. I've got plenty. If Sarah's smiling because I've got plenty of corny ones. But I suppose in relation to this, there's 3 that are, I suppose, relevant. You don't know what you don't know. One of my biggest favorite sayings. Users will be users, which again, we can have the right policy, you name it, but the user will still be a user. And my new one for 23, which came out late last year, was, and again, it was around everyone being personally affected, and now you're professionally aware. So to give you context as to where that came up, as I was having a conversation with the CIO and 15 of his delegates or reports, he said, cybersecurity, unstructured data, cleaning up my network drive now keeps me awake at night. I said, no disrespect, but this has been around for about 10 years. Why now? And then I made the, I suppose, statement that, you've been personally affected, so now you're professionally aware. And I asked the question, Medibank, Optus, insert all the other ones, and he said yes, yes, no, yes, no. So again, another little example of that. So some of our real users, real stories, real results. So this obviously anonymized for the client's scenario, except for mine. So this, again, this happened to me 5 years ago now. So again, I'm probably a little bit more down the path of managing my personal information, having a value for that information. But I did a refinance with a bank. I actually told this story with the presentation Errol and I did with banks, and all the banks went, no, 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 we wouldn't do that. That bank was in the room. They didn't get told of that, obviously, but I disclosed that one of the banks was in the room that I did use. So it was quite an interesting sort of a whoa moment. But obviously refinance or mortgage documents, no doubt some of them have done, even rental applications these days, a fair bit of information you've got to give out. One of the users saved my application on a network drive. They called it template. They then sent that to 25 people, and one person actually responded. So I'll say Sarah in this example. Hey, insert bank name. I think you've sent me the wrong information. You've sent me someone's data. And long story short, that came because someone called it a template and they didn't know what was in an actual document. So my personal information, houses, mortgages, passports, wife's names, kids, dogs, pets, you name it, all went out to the public, to 25 different people. So a smaller net, but still quite I suppose, an interesting sort of example of breaching my personal data. Another one, so this, for those that don't watch certain TV shows at home, we've got Game of Thrones here on the left-hand side, we've got Nashville in the middle, we've got Pretty Little Cat. The big thing, and I suppose what all these have in common, all of these were found on network drives, multiple different clients. Cat videos were found in IT, which was an interesting joke we were making, and then we found cat videos that they had downloaded. Separately to illegally sharing pirated content on a corporate network, and I'm conscious I'm recording, but I can talk to doing hop swapping stuff outside of this post. But on a corporate network, nothing I personally would do, nor that, again, a number of clients, I suppose, don't like. The big thing here is all of these files, and I'm not just talking about one file of Nashville, we're talking about seasons of Nashville, seasons of Game of Thrones, all sitting corporately, sitting on those network drives, all getting backed up, and nobody knew they were there, except obviously for the users doing the illegal sharing. Again, when we highlighted that to the IT, obviously quickly rectified, but as an example of some of the things we found in that use case. We had another little client who did a bit of a cleanup. So their use case was about reducing their network drive, cleaning up their rot, so the redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. From here, they then wanted to archive and move their network drive into Content Manager. So again, we're only talking about just over a terabyte of the network drive, bigger in the other spaces, but the network drive was the focus. Managed to reduce nearly half, so 420 gig, 350,000 files were moved, and then, were removed, and then we archive the network drive into Content Manager. We don't just stick it in a block and stick it in a filing cabinet to the right of me. That way we could actually, I suppose, then look to have retention and disposal about those different items and that data itself. We had an example of a steak and rum challenge. So this was an example a client said it was up north. For those that know me, I do enjoy a rum or a beer or a drink when required. But the long story short, the client said, you're not going to find credit cards in my environment. Money on the table, we don't have them. So great, bet you we can. Long story short, it was a client up north. And he said, let's have a beer and a steak challenge for it. I said, great, I'll take a rum instead. And in short, we found the CEO's credit card on lots of travel forms. So again, smaller entities, but the CEO's credit card. So like an example of Errol here, I've got Errol's credit card sitting on all these forms, hypothetically through the network in an open space. So again, everyone could find these if they weren't looking. If it got breached, they could definitely find them. Hundreds of different travel forms for that whole entity, personal data, their names, date of birth, where they'd been staying, all those types of things were sitting there. And obviously all those files were secured post actually finding them themselves.
So Carl, just a quick question: of all this discovery work we've done, have we ever not found credit card information on the network?
No, never. Not once. Everyone's got it. Everyone will say they don't have it. But there's a couple other examples coming up that Sarah can
A
talk to.
rum and a steak's a pretty cheap bet, but it's pretty safe.
It's a pretty safe bet for sure.
I can't keep saying now, bet my wife, mortgage, or a house or a kid. It's not politically correct. So steak and rum it is.
Fair enough. Well, this is a nice segue, Errol. This is a use case from a state government organisation. They have hundreds of thousands of users, so there's going to be unstructured data sitting everywhere. They also have access to Teams, SharePoint, file systems. So there's only so much the IM team can actually do in that space to provide controls and processes to support the users. But this organisation needed to be PCI DSS compliant, so they needed to find where they're holding those credit cards in that unstructured data, but also within Content Manager, which was interesting. Even though it was managed, they weren't supposed to be holding that data. So what we did was we hooked up FAS, we found lots of credit cards. That number there was indicative of the amount of credit cards we found on day one, not overall. Overall, we're now at about 17,000. So what we've done is we've hooked up Exchange, Network Drive's Content Manager for this use case and found those credit card numbers. They're now working through removing those credit card numbers or the files themselves, so either redacting or just, removing the files that they no longer require to keep, basically. So, still working through that one. But on top of that, we also identified for this organisation all of the other additional risk items they're holding. So above credit cards, they're holding license numbers, Medicare numbers. All of this is in unstructured data. So that's a bit of an eye-opener for that organisation, and they're taking a look at what else they're holding to see what they can do with that as well.
It's also interesting that some of this was presented pre-Optus, didn't get much traction. Post-Optus, super urgent, need to fix these problems.
Cyber Directorate. Yep.
Yeah. We had another example where we're going through, and again, credit cards is the bread and butter, and we'll talk more about another one shortly. But we actually were running through a training session, and we had a finance person or a CFO in the room. During that training session, we picked up 4,000 credit cards. They were Amex because we could tell by the pattern that Amex credit card had. The CFO had the insert here the oh shit moment that I call it, that everybody has of what do I do and what oh my god, what do I do next? And again, we went through well, you've got a PCI DSS compliance document, and you're saying you've got all these policies, but you've now should enact those policies. Obviously, again, targeted, remediated, secured, all the fun that went with it. But it was that, again, moment in that I suppose scenario where they just didn't know what they didn't know, and they didn't know that they're holding all those Amex cards. And one of them, and which very similar to the previous one Sarah talked about, was a spreadsheet with all the different cards, the numbers, the names, the people for a large organization. So it's a common thing that we find. It's the easy one that most people understand. Whether you like finding credit cards or it's important to you or not, it's one of those things that we often see.
This one, another organisation, very large organisation, they looked at a problem there where they had consolidated drives together over a period of time. Obviously, as companies merge and demerge, their information flies everywhere. So what they needed to do was look at their network drives for starters and understand what their rot was. So very first step in most of the analysis journeys is to look at your rot, look at what your duplication is and understand that. So these guys hooked up, they looked at 50 terabytes all up, but they ended up with 19.7 terabytes of rot. So 11, nearly 12 of that was duplication in itself. So the return on investment there was huge for them. They could save up to $2.5 million just in storage over 5 years. But that was just the start of their journey, and they're still going with that. So that was a pretty cool one.
And that's an interesting approach, is to, okay, how do you fund a data discovery project? Well, in a way, by taking that approach, it's kind of like self-funding. You can partially fund it through being smart and managing your rot better and reducing your storage costs.
Exactly that. Yep. Another good one for this customer as well was when there was a disposal freeze issued by Queensland and National Archives around management of records relating to vulnerable people. So because they had already scanned all of their data and understood what they held, they could then use the tool to find information related to that disposal freeze and use that same tool to put a hold on that. So as Carl says, users will be users. They do have rights to delete from shared drives. So to be able to put a hold on that and stop people from doing that, that was another cool use case for these guys.
This example was around an information request. So again, that's sort of leading on from what Sarah said about finding information. This one was a bit of a shocker for us. And again, we don't name names here, but an organization took a large amount of files. They gave them to a staff member on a USB. That staff member then went home, plugged it into their home personal computer, and started looking through everything, thousands and thousands of documents and emails to find where certain names and numbers and those things were mentioned for a discovery or information request. They spent about 12 days. That person, a lot of overtime, weekends, 7 days straight, just continued to look through information. Again, when we found out about this, we went, hang on a minute, there's a better way to do this. Let's use the tool to search for information because Carl likes to sleep at night, as an example. Limited, but I do like it. So it was around about, let's point that data on a space where the tool can see it, allow it to go and scan for, Carl Duncan, insert address and whatever the company name may be, and go and find all those, that relevant information, as opposed to humanly looking through 4,500 documents manually off the network, which was the bigger risk at that point in time.
This one comes through with a bit of a privacy lens. So as we all probably preaching to the converted to the people on this call, but we all understand that in 2018, the GDPR was becoming enforced. It wasn't just threatened anymore. You would, face fines and you would be held accountable for holding European citizen data if they don't want you to. So this university obviously has international students. They needed to understand where their passport data was being held outside of where it should have been. So obviously, you do probably need passport data for current students, but, do you need to be storing them on the network drive or in a proper system? So this one was really interesting. We pointed at a network drive and found over 40,000 of these EU passports that matched the passport for EU's patterns, if you like. So yeah, we managed to be able to tell them to either do something with it or you could be in trouble.
Didn't know what they didn't know.
Didn't know, no.
This was an example, again, close to heart in the oh no, insert moment. We had a CIO come to us recently, in sort of the last 12 months, and say, oh, cloud is cheap, let's move my network drive. And we're like, no, you've got this tool, we can help you with it, and actually look to, pack for a light lunch, understand what you've got, get rid of what you don't need, archive what you, and destroy what you can, and then just, move a proportion of that for the new business. At the time said, no, takes too long, I'm just going to move it. Moved a whole network drive up into Azure, so it was 50 terabytes of data. And then obviously once the free credits ran out, it now cost them 4 times the cost of what it used to cost them on premise. And long story short, very quickly after that, gave us a call back, said, yep, sorry, how do we now fix that now? So again, one of those, and this use case comes up every single time I talk to anyone in IT and any government entity or any sort of C-suite person. They're just saying, we're moving it, it's not my problem, I've got to back it up, I'm going to maintain it. And again, as I said at the start of the presentation, now having those C-suite people come to us and going, my SharePoint is full, what do I do? And my first question is, go talk to your information management records people, because they know what they can do if you let them. And again, they're now at that sort of top level in that space.
This use case is one of my favorites, being an archivist at heart. So this organization, they do have a really great relationship between the IT and IM teams. So they work closely together. Their processes for setting up repositories for users and controlling those is really great now, but obviously everyone has legacy data that follows along with them. So as well as finding credit cards and all the things that we typically find in that unstructured data for this customer, they actually had some really cool permanent records that they didn't know about. So for these guys, I think the high risk and high value items, being able to identify records that they should have probably transferred to archives or retained permanently is another cool use case. The data discovery process, where do we begin?
Sarah, just before you start that was an interesting comment you made around an organisation that has their IT and the records people actually work together, because that's quite often something we've faced forever, isn't it? Is that who's responsible? And the question then comes about is like, who is ultimately responsible for data in an organisation at the highest level? Who is that person that doesn't sleep at night? And we've heard a couple of stories recently where the people have walked away from their job because of the pressure of responsibility. So it's a tough thing, but left to a business unit alone, is not going to work, because it's a big challenge, and it's a big team effort. Yeah.
And that's a good point, though. A lot of those use cases that we just went through, they involved their business as well. The people who were responsible for managing the information, who knew what was contained in that information, but just couldn't quantify it. So a lot of the time they involved their users and got them to do the actioning, move it to Content Manager, delete it if it's no longer appropriate, and so on. So yeah, I guess from here we will probably give you a bit of an idea of where to begin based on where we've been with other organisations. So for starters, you need to take an inventory. You need to know where your data is. Is it held in SharePoint? Is it sitting on a server that is no longer accessed anymore? Is it in Teams that's just exploding like crazy? So take an inventory, know where you need to look, and know what users are using it, what business areas are using those repositories. And then plan. So where are you now? Get that inventory, get that asset list, that asset register together, and plan to where you want to be. Do you want to be working all in content? Do you want to allow people to manage information in place in SharePoint? Where your goals are is will determine what your plan looks like. And break it into manageable steps. So initially you're going to scan the information. You're going to scan all of it. You're going to scan targeted areas. Understand where you want to be looking to start with, and then analyze that information once you've done your scanning. You can get your native reports, you can get fancy custom reports, whatever you need to do in that space, know who you need to report to, and then what action are you going to take after you've provided that report and the approvals to go ahead. The biggest thing I think we face, Carl, with every customer is understanding the rules. What can you access? What can the service account access? Who's going to play what role? Who's going to be responsible for approvals? Do you even need approvals if your users can delete from the shared drive? So getting all of that documented and putting that governance in place is really, really important. I don't know, Carl, if you wanted to add to that.
No, I was going to say I've got all day, but the last one around about approvals. So it often comes up when any other people in Content Manager or Trim or those types of things, when you've got to do a disposal, you've got to give blood, you've got to go through, and I say give blood figuratively, you go through this number of different approvals to get something disposed. On a network drive, Errol could delete something today, a whole network drive, a whole structure, no one would care. When you then start to show a lens of some of the information, the types of information and the volume of the information, very quickly people go back to wanting to give blood. And I've had to talk a number of different clients, as a Sarah, off the ledge of saying, if you do not need the CEO of an organization to get rid of some data sitting on a network drive, because people do it today and you don't care. But as soon as we start to show some highlight and some visual, visualness to the actual problem, it starts to get a little bit bigger.
Yeah, we've seen the other side where people have sort of said, well, we shouldn't be allowing our users to delete from the shared drive, and they've worked with IT to stop that happening. And then we've seen an interim approach where, well, hold on, we don't necessarily need to go to all of our data custodians for those official approvals, but maybe the director of the business area could be the sign-off point, or maybe the CIO. So yeah, there's understanding what that looks like for your organization is really important.
Is it fair to say that the success that we've had has happened when we've, the initial discussion around the entire data platform and landscape is just such a big thing, and people struggle to perceive how they're going to fix that. The language is really about, well, it's just growing out of control, and it becomes the mindset. But when we've taken small chunks and we do like a proof of value, so to speak, Carl's favourites, when we take a subset and have a look at that and actually get some metrics out of that, which are indicative of the bigger landscape, we tend to get much better traction by doing that. And there's smaller startups, smaller projects, but the whole big picture, when you just say to someone, how are you going to fix it? It's just mentally such a big thing that you just get the blockage. Yeah.
Also, that's the point. Where does it start? What is your use case? Why are you doing this in the first place? What do you need to fix?
It's also interesting to know that there's hidden costs, or we often talk about that your network drive, or as an example, wherever unstructured data may sit, has a cost, has a tin cost as an example, but that cost is sitting in a budget and the executive don't see it. So again, a recent example is a client's paying $300,000 every year for the network drive. That's a cost that they are aware of, but when it's one line item for IT that doesn't really get above the IT total budget, it's nothing in the big scheme of things. So when we're saying that we can clean up 30 to 50% of that and save, 150 grand, that's not a known cost to some of the senior people or executives in that organization as well.
And also that hidden cost around what you mentioned before with the information search. How long does it take someone to find something? The man hours that it takes to filter and sort through data that's not structured is insane, and often doesn't even become discovered.
Yep. And until you quantify that, then you don't actually really know. It's just, again, Sarah's a full-time staff member. I don't need to worry about what she costs as a government statement. She can search her information. If it takes her 10 days or 10 minutes, it doesn't really bother me because she's an asset that's paid for, so to speak.
Yeah, that's it. And so that kind of leads into, once you have scanned, analysed, your reporting mechanisms, what you're going to do with your data, how are you going to slice that up? So are you going to look at business functions? Are you going to look at quick wins where you can find your invoices and get rid of those? So understanding how you're going to slice your data once you know what's there is really important. And that then informs your strategy. So we'd like to break it into chunks for organisations when we do develop these strategies. So what's short term look like for you? Are you going to dedupe? Is that your short term? That that in itself is not a small thing. Medium term, are you going to start to work with those business areas, move information into Content Manager, destroy things that you no longer need to keep, all of that sort of thing. And then long term, how are you going to monitor this? How are you going to make sure this doesn't happen again? So developing a strategy, planning to fail to plan, saying, as we say, you need to know what that's going to look like for you. And you will need to review that as well. It's not going to be a strategy that just fits and go for gold. So reviewing that as well, understanding where you're at too. Again, will you need approvals to move, delete, put things on hold? That's a pretty stock standard. You need to have a strategy and a plan. And then report on your progress. Who needs to know what you've done? What are your goals? How are you going to achieve them? How are you going to report that you've actually achieved those?
Executive need to know because they don't know. So anything that we obviously do, and again, if we're doing it at, say, the IT level, the IM level, it's about pushing that information up. It's trying to get some face time. It's trying to show that value that your area, your organization, whatever the project is actually achieving, because otherwise they won't know what you're actually doing or the impact for that organization.
Correct. So yeah, some tips and tricks again, always have that strategy, continue to review that. So you're going to find things that you never expected to find. They need to be woven into the strategy depending on, the scale of what you find. Ensure you have that business buy-in. So as Carl said, not just the executives, but the people who have created the data, who need the data, who work with it every day. It's going to affect their processes. So you need to work with them to understand what they need as a result of you cleaning up that information and how they can contribute to it as well. And what's that ROI going to look like? Make sure your resources, your levels of resources match your goals. This is a fun one. So, you could have, right, I want to scan 50 terabytes. I want to know what's in my unstructured 50 terabyte data sets and so on. But one person's not going to tackle that in a month. So coming back to that strategy, if you have half an FTE, don't, bite off more than you can chew. Start small, approach things, business area by business area. Right, however you want to approach that, that's going to get you your best results for the resources that you have and get the business on board. So we did have a couple of customers actually have got their customers, so their business areas actually involved, and even to the point where they were tagging and reviewing and moving to Content Manager and saying, this is what's important to us, so we need to keep this. So
I think
that
resource one is quite critical, because Sarah and I often talk people down, which is, I suppose, counterintuitive, but it's about saying, if you can only manage this much, then that's what you should start with. And if you think you can manage that much, let's go shorter, show some value, again, highlight the findings, because there will be a plethora of them and you'll have the oh shit moment, and all those types of things, rather than just trying to, again, eat the elephant in a whole bite, so to speak. Just starting small and continuously getting wins as part of that process. So one of the things that, or I suppose one of the tools, so obviously as a provider and a vendor, we went to market, we're a Microfocus or an open text partner as of 2 weeks ago. So one of the big things for us was around finding tool sets that sort of met our client needs. And anyone's had a look on LinkedIn recently, there was I suppose a whole video and interviews with Errol as to why we do what we do and why we select certain vendors and products as part of that. For us, the cyber res or the FAS products, so File Analysis Suite, really, I suppose, is one piece in this bigger sort of data trust picture that we've been sort of talking about with clients over the years and working with Microfocus on. And it really covers just this first phase of discovery. So again, in our opinion, and again, happy to have conversations around this, but if you can't protect data that you don't know what it is, as an example, you can't monitor data if you don't know what it is, you can't govern it if you don't know what it is. So discovery is that first step. And again, the bank conversation that Errol and I had late last year, you would think a lot more maturity around, managing people's data, financial records, personal data. Again, Carl got breach comment. But a lot of those had the policies, had the people. So they had chief data officers and CDOs and CTOs and CIOs and all the things. But when it came down to actually, how do you monitor that policy? They didn't know. How do you actually prove that that's the thing? They couldn't. So yes, they had the piece of paper. We also had another example on that same scenario with a client where they said, we are PCI DSS compliant, as Sarah said before, going from a merchant level 2 to a merchant level 1. I've done that in a past life. It's not fun. But they actually were saying, no, we don't accept credit cards. I'm like, well, you do. And they're like, no, we don't. We've got payment gateways, terminals, you name it. Again, I went back to my second favorite saying, users will be users, and we showed them where a credit card was received hours before our meeting to a network drive. To a shared mailbox, which got saved on a network drive. So, those types of examples of, again, the discovery, and just because you've got the policy or the other things, again, you need something to, I suppose, manage, monitor, and work through that. So for us, we talk about FAS as this, I call it a Swiss Army knife, hence the picture. But going through all these sort of examples, and again, some of these might resonate to some people in the room, it may not, some may resonate to all, assuming one will resonate to one of you. But when you look at your organization, each one of these has a tie-in and an ROI to a certain part of the business. So you might be the information management team, you might be the IT team, and some of these will resonate. As we sort of talked about before, again, data growth. So again, looking to actually reduce your data, reduce your holdings, manage that unstructured, but also leaving into semi-structured and structured. The same principles apply for those structured or semi-structured information. Understanding your high risk, high volume data or high value data. So, again, do I care about Carl's daughter's birthday certificate, or do I care about the corporate records that we hold because it's citizen related data for patient information, as an example? The reduction of ROT, so the redundant, obsolete, and trivial, again, plenty of use cases we talked through here, or dedupe for short. And again, those examples of, we talked about those hard tin costs, but you've also got those human costs that are hard to quantify often, or hard to be believed, that, Sarah in her job searching for information and she can't find the latest bit of information, or as an example, she finds the wrong policy, which then tells her to do the wrong thing in an event of emergency, which has happened many times. Those types of things are hard to, I suppose, put a cost on or a value on until it happens. Information searches, again, we talked about those types of things before, so plenty of those. The reduction of backup, so again, less data, faster backups, quicker processes to work through. The migration to 365, clean up and understanding before moving, but also the management of that stuff when it's in place. So again, if you're, managing and using those environments, actually understanding what you've got and how to manage it, and in those examples. The sensitivity of information, again, the use cases we talked around, the driver's licenses, the credit cards, those types of information, personal names, health information, all those types of things are super important. The protecting against data breaches and the cybersecurity part, again, goes back to that example we talked around. If a breach happened today in an unstructured space, what have you lost? Again, no one can actually ever tell that unless you're, again, using tools to define that in advance, which obviously then also helps from a cybersecurity perspective. I know a number of entities, and I've been speaking to the OpenText and Microfocus team on this for a while. Since certain things in the media, you'll obviously see cybersecurity has a lot more attention at the moment, which means budgets have increased. Before, obviously, Optus, everything else, cybersecurity was a big thing. So tying these types of activities or these types of tools, discoveries, and processes to cybersecurity allows feet in the door to enable that, as opposed to saying, I want to clean up all my deduplication, Mr. or Mrs. CIO. That's not as topical at the moment, or maybe ever, as opposed to protecting cyber, us from a cyber event, managing our information, finding the sensitive data has more, I suppose, clout, for want of a better word. Obviously, again, the privacy, the legislation, GDPR drivers, they're always been there, always have been. We're very lax across Australia, but definitely in Queensland, that's all going to change. If you've read the news, this is happening before Optus. It's just accelerated that approach. And that ability to, for those people, for content manager people in the room, is that managing information in place. So that difference of trying to get everyone to put stuff into a system rather than let that system do what it's really good at and manage that information in place, again, using FAS or the actual tool itself. So again, a number of different sort of use cases that we often see relate to organizations. And this, again, if you look at a number of these and you look at the ROIs, this is what stacks up to show some value. Mr. Errol.
So yeah, that's kind of bringing us to a close, and I hope you found it interesting. It definitely is for us. It's an ongoing journey, but we do dream about a position where we can control all organizations' data to a point where the security guys are not so worried about a breach itself, but data just doesn't get breached. I regard data as being a business at the moment, and while it's got value in the I'll say the outside world, when that changes, then we're starting to win that. And I think rather than having an approach of like it's just growing out of control and it's too big, let's just change our attitude and change our approach to saying, what are we going to do to stop it? The good thing is it's mostly about attitude and approach. Technology is actually in place. For those that know me, I love technology, but there's been an exponential change in capabilities of technology. So once upon a time, we would have said, "Oh, we just can't do some of these things." That's not the case anymore. Now we can do this plus a whole lot more, and that'll change month by month. So just step in there and let's start the journey. One of the things taking out of this as a call to action, and if you like, contact us for a bit of a chat. We can grab Sarah and Carl and just have a session around what your data management strategy looks like and how data discovery fits into that. Invariably, that becomes a case of like, all the policies that you create, were they done to tick a box or were they done for actual real outcomes? So there's that as well. And the proof of value, definitely for us, there's a lot of mileage in being able to say, here's a quick snapshot of your environment, and this is the metrics out of that. It's interesting that we talk about FAS as being our preferred product to do this. We actually get that product as a SaaS model product. We can get that up and running and actually produce results in, I'll say days to be safe, but I think
12 minutes.
12 minutes was the
So once you get past the red tape and the accounts and stuff, and once we push the button and start scanning, we're in business and we're starting to produce some results which are meaningful.
And that's a good point. So Errol made a couple of points there. So we still talk to organizations about finding credit cards, and that's, again, it's the simple thing that I think we're desensitized to the oh wow moment for those ones. But there are still organizations we have conversations with, and like, you can't find credit cards. It's just impossible. Like, technology wise, it's not impossible. It's been not impossible for many years, but there's that belief of that technology which Errol talked about. And as Errol said before, one of our customer journeys that I think we've shared on LinkedIn and a couple other places recently was within 12 minutes of scanning, we were giving back to the head of IT. This is what we're finding already. And again, there was that, fail fast or succeed fast, which one you'd like to pick. But for them, that was that, again, from scanning to finding sensitive data in 12 minutes. And again, from that proof of value that Errol talked about, within 2 days, ingesting all this data, coming up with a report, a week later, handing them this report, the tool, the products. Here's an example. And that customer actually went from someone who was kind of, I don't know if I need this type of approach, to I've only got these real key use cases, to, wow, this is bigger and that's my oh shit moment, and this is a problem, to now actually getting the point of using that report for business funding, to now, as of last week, going, this tool I can't live without. It does all these things for me and actually solves it. So that journey of a non-believer, so to speak, to a believer was again done pretty quickly.
Yeah, commonly we see, file systems are still around. We see a lot of that. We see a lot of SharePoint. One organisation we work with has something like 80,000 SharePoint sites. So the IT and IM team didn't really get a chance to work together, and it's just exploded. Teams is part of SharePoint, but Teams is very common these days. We see some Google Drive, some AWS S3 buckets. There's a range of them.
Yeah. And again, that example of Google Drives for some of our education customers, they have a Microsoft-centric center, and then they have a Google-centric external for their different organizations. So the tween between Microsoft and others definitely does happen.
But also on top of that, Carl, we've also got everyone Exchange. It often gets left out of that picture. How many people, there's inbox people and there's people who like to use their folders and structure their information.
Yeah.
Not naming names on this call, but
folders.
So, more often than not, those Exchange boxes are just not cleaned up, not looked at, and left to be open to all sorts of intrusions.
And that's the other thing, Andy, on that one is, you don't have to target and everything. So it's not all of Exchange. It could be certain key ones. And we've done that for a client recently for that PCI DSS stuff. So it was, the mailboxes that were more susceptible to receiving, student forms, student applications, or potentially those credit card scenarios. Again, certain parts of network drives that would have more information around that. Again, it just depends on your use case.
So are you actually, sorry to interrupt, are you actually plugging in kind of parameters? So for example, if you're looking for credit cards, how are you actually how does that kind of work looking for a credit card? Do you tell it you've got to look for like 16 digits? Do you plug it in and then it kind of runs? Is that how it works, or you tell it what you want to look for?
Black magic.
All of the above.
Pretty much. So out of the box, the FAS product has again a number of, I suppose, what they call grammars or patterns, for want of a better word, already baked into the product. But in saying that, you can also make your own. So you can select and go, well, I'm looking for EU-related data. I'm looking for the Australian privacy principle data if you're Oz-based. Financial data is important to me, credit cards. And again, to give you an example, can be 12, 13, 14, 16 spaces, non-spaces, dashes, or slashes. So all of that's already baked into the product. So there's not too much thought for that. Separately to that, though, you can create what we sort of say is your own organizational or your company view. And this is where, I always use employee data because it's the easiest one, but your organization might have employee pattern that FAS doesn't know about, and you can create your own. Like literally, we teach you to fish. It might be EMP 123. So it will, when it's scanning content, it will go, oh, hang on, I found that. Now I've got to flag that to someone to actually look at in that space. So you can create your own. You can use the out of the box ones. Like I said, you can scan lots of different things in lots of different ways.
All right, good stuff. That's good to know.
And sorry, just to loop back to your persona question. Again, it depends on how we're introduced to that organization. So as an example, for one recently was actually brought in by the IM team, who then again ring-fenced and got everyone from the whole IT. So we had the CIO and all of the 15 people in IT. And that was a whole of IT approach. But though it goes back to those use cases, they all worked for different people in that room. So, that one use case or all those use cases didn't work for one person, but a cross-section of all those initiatives, all those people having different responsibilities helped in that. But then we've had the flip side of IT bringing us in. So,
all right. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
No, good question. Did anyone else have any other questions online? Otherwise, again, I appreciate everyone's time. Again, we'll share the recording with those that couldn't make it today and obviously those that did. But really appreciate your time and thanks very much.